there are times when God will allow, and I've seen it, it doesn't happen all the time, but it's happened to me multiple times in my ministry, when God allows for an event in my life to intersect with a study of in the scriptures that I'm particularly meditating on or focusing on that week, and they cross in such a way that the event illuminates in an illustrative way the text that I've been trying to get at and grasp. And that was something that happened to me this week as I was studying the text for this morning, which is Romans chapter 1 and verse 17. I'll get to the event in a minute, but I do want to state outright the thesis of the book of Romans. I am not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek, because in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith, for faith, as it is written, the one who is righteous by faith, he shall live. That statement is the thesis of this letter, which, if proven, Paul says should bring a Gentile, or really any person, to a point of being able to present their lives to God as an acceptable sacrifice. It's primarily going to happen through the work of the gospel in the life of the person to do something in them to make them a sacrifice to God that they otherwise would not have been able to be apart from that sacrifice. So the thesis has the end of making us acceptable sacrifices in the eyes of God. So you can't stress enough this verse, Romans 1, 16 and 17. You have to underline it. You need to memorize this. You need to make this a part of your understanding of the letter because it's totally central to it. And we started it last week. We're looking at it again this morning, especially verse 17. Okay, now, having said the thesis and the verse, let me get to the event from this week. As you all know, I am not averse to engaging in social media with the statement of gospel or even just some general truth that in principle has been gained from Scripture, irrespective of how that might look on me or how that might cause offense in someone. I will do so. I will engage in those ways so long as I see the fruit of doing so, and so long as my conscience forbids me from keeping quiet on it. Kind of in the way that Jeremiah said there was a fire shut up in his bones. I kind of understand that a little bit. There's this time where it's just welling up and it's just going to come out. You all know that that's how I engage at times. Now, I want to say that engaging is a good thing. Engaging is a good thing because the world is putting out a message constantly. Now, what happens if the Christian voice, the voice of reason, the voice of gospel, the voice of the truth of God never issues a rebuttal or a counter statement or something to bring us back to the basics? What happens if there's only the false voice and there's never the voice of reason? Well, then that's just the way that people are going to go if there's not something counter, especially if people are not investigating and searching the truth out for themselves. There has to be a voice to counter it. So it's a good thing to engage. I think sometimes we think that engaging is bad because it sometimes creates arguments. Well, you can have an argument and you can have an engagement and you can do it in a respectful, reasonable, loving way. And so there should be the encouragement to engage while also saying, I'm going to do it in a way that doesn't call names, that doesn't make general judgments that are me making an assessment of somebody that I couldn't gain for myself. There is a good way to engage and to do it lovingly in John's gospel, speaking the truth in love. So the command, speak truth, is there. Do it in a loving and rational way. It doesn't mean that people will always take it that way, but you can issue it in that way, and I think that that's a good thing in the eyes of God. So I have a friend from college who we're probably on opposite ends of the spectrum, and we engage with one another quite a bit. I believe always respectfully. And if he makes a statement, I will make a counter statement, and he'll do the same with me. And this week, he made a statement, and it had something to the effect of bringing about social justice and justice in the world. And I commented and I said that, one of the things that I think probably the biggest problem with the movement for social justice right now is the lack of an objective standard or base to determine what is and what isn't just. I think we just take it for granted that, well, everybody has an idea in their mind and in their heart of what's just. But when the rubber actually meets the road and you get those people in a room together, there will be disagreement. And, at some point they're going to say, well, what is our standard? What is the objective base from which we're going to determine what's right and what's wrong? Because we know from history that the human heart and the opinion of man is not an objective standard, because those change literally from one generation to the next, from one person to the next, from one unit of people to the next. Someone in Kingfisher County is not going to be the same as somebody in Orange County. If you were to take a general, what's justice from the general population of both of those places, it's not going to be the same. So my critique was that that's what you're lacking. You're lacking an objective base. And I offered the Bible as that solution. And, I like to study history. It is a historical fact that all of the founders were in agreement that biblical truth and biblical principle were what should be guiding us as a nation. John Adams said that our Constitution is wholly inadequate to govern anyone besides a moral and religious people. That's kind of what the people governing the people is all about, is having religious, moral people who govern themselves and ensure that we have checks and balances and stay in in the proper place. So that's kind of our history. It's not like, hey, we've never had the Bible as a guiding standard, let's throw it in there now. No, that's kind of what led to what we are today. And we're just forgetting it, and we're throwing that out. Well, I offered that, and somebody, again, very respectfully, offered back this critique of my statement. And he said something along the lines of, how does a book which condones slavery and genocide serve as a moral compass for America in 2020? What do you think about that question? Well, I pondered on it a lot. And it's not as though this is the first time I've ever thought about the question. You have to work through those things. When I was thinking of how I could respond, I first thought, well, I could point out that the question is based on a false assumption. The Bible is no more asking for Christians to wipe out other nations than it is asking for Christians to build an ark. There are elements of Israel in its specifically theocratic function when they were a physical kingdom with physical priests, with physical borders and a physical land, with God as their actual king and physical laws as their guiding ethic. And they were to be a physical nation which represented some spiritual truths that God was going to eventually bring out. And as such, God had them, especially in the conquest of Canaan, because this is what the guy was talking about, is the conquest of Canaan that you read about in Joshua. When God said, I want you to go in and devote these places to destruction. That place is going to be your place. It's going to be your inhabitants, and I will dwell in the midst of it, and you will be my people, a kingdom of priests, a light unto the nations. So I thought I could approach it from that angle. God is not asking Christians in 2020 to go do that. That was a specific function of Israel as a theocratic state. But as I thought about it more, I thought, the underlying assumption in his critique, which he may not have stated outright, is that God is not righteous. And that as he reads the Bible, and he said he's read the Bible through about 10 times. He used to be a missionary. He said as he has read the Bible, he sees these points where he cannot see God as righteous. So I thought that's the underlying assumption here. So how do you answer that? Someone who's got the critique of God that he's not righteous. And so here's this event, and I've been thinking over this. Here's somebody. Now again, he didn't say God is not righteous, but if you read through his statement, that's what he's saying. And that's how I had framed the question in my mind to respond to him. And I'm reading the text for this morning. In the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. And I got the question, how do you point out to somebody that God is righteous, who has an indictment against him for whatever reason? And I'm reading, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. And I'm asking the question, here's somebody who doesn't think God is righteous. How can I respond to that? And then it's like, ding! This bell went off. This light bulb went off in my head. It's like the gospel. In the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. This is Paul's answer to anybody who believes that they hold a legitimate critique against God and against his righteousness. If God to someone has not been righteous, then Romans 1:17 is the first place to go, and then you have to expose some things in it. In the gospel, God's righteousness is revealed. Now, you remember last week, I talked about this, Paul, why does Paul say, I'm not ashamed of the gospel? Why does he say that? I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Well, I said the implication of that statement is not that the gospel is somehow inherently shameful, or that there are particulars in the gospel, in the whole scheme of the gospel message, like maybe the conquest of Canaan in the book called Joshua, that in order to herald the gospel, you're going to have to kind of brush it under the rug and sweep it away and pretend as though it's not there. That's not why Paul said that he's not ashamed of the gospel. It's not that there are any particulars of it that are shameful. It is that the world, in their rendering of it, will shape it and frame it and present it in such a way to make you feel ashamed for it. And I experienced that a little bit this week. I didn't feel any shame at all, but I could feel that the attempt being made to that end. One of the individuals commenting on this thread, he said that scriptures like Joshua and like Leviticus are ones that make him cringe. And so he has resolved in himself, or he has determined that he doesn't believe the Bible is an inerrant product of the Holy Spirit, but that it is an erroneous work of man, being somehow guided by God to move in the direction of morality, though doing it in a very imperfect way. And that made me sigh, that someone could once see the Bible as inerrant and then move away from that sentiment. But this text brought out another reason why Paul is saying he's not ashamed of the gospel. The first reason why he said it, he said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it's the power of God for salvation. Listen, you can't be ashamed of the one means by which the world is going to be saved. I can't be ashamed of the only manner in the universe to save me and my wife and my boys and my fellow man. I won't be ashamed of that. I think that's the first thing Paul's saying. I'm not ashamed because of that reason. But this week, the studies brought out another one. The additional reason why he says that he's not ashamed is because the gospel, if you look at it, if you really look at it closely, it reveals that God is, has been, and always will be righteous. The fact of the matter is, you cannot go to the cross of Jesus and look upon our Savior hanging there, crying out to God to forgive us while we were crucifying him, and walk away and think that in any degree or any measure, God is not righteous or just. The cross thoroughly reveals it. And this is the interesting thing. In Romans 1:17, Paul uses this word. He says, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. That word revealed is a Greek word. I'm going to use it because you'll know an English equivalent to it. Apocalyptite. What's that sound like? Apocalypse. Now, our idea of an apocalypse is kind of the end of the world, this big war going on up in the heavens and whatever else. But the idea, the original idea behind apocalypse, which is also John's revelation, the revelation that he received in the letter we call Revelation, that word there is apocalypse, apocalyptite. All right. It is a word that means to make fully known in the most comprehensive and thorough possible measures. Paul is not using a word that means, it was kind of shown a little bit, it was dimly shown. No, he says, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is apocalypse. It's something that if you look at the gospel, you see God as righteous, totally, thoroughly. And if you look at the gospel, you cannot conceivably walk away thinking God is not righteous. If such is still your disposition, then the gospel has not yet been revealed to you. When you see Jesus delivered by night to Pilate, it's revealing the righteousness of God. When Jesus is spat upon by the leaders of the temple and beaten with a rod, the righteousness of God is revealed. When a crown of 3-inch spikes is stuck into the brow of Jesus and his temple bled, the righteousness of God is revealed. When Jesus was scourged, and when bits of rock and glass and metal on the ends of strands of leather were ripped into the back of his flesh, the righteousness of God is revealed. When Jesus was forced to carry a heavy wooden beam that his body was far too weak to carry, the righteousness of God is revealed. When Jesus was nailed to a block of wood and raised up for the world to wag their heads at him, while the soldiers below him cast lots for his garments, and they mocked him as the King of the Jews, calling for him to come down, the righteousness of God is revealed. When the body of Jesus took its last breath and his body sagged down on the cross, righteousness of God is revealed. When Jesus was lifted off the cross and lifeless, limp, carried to a cold tomb and laid onto cold, hard ground, the righteousness of God is revealed. When 3 days later, Jesus rose up out of the grave, alive, full of the Spirit, and totally healthy, the righteousness of God is revealed. And the point of Paul is that the climax of history and the entirety of the scheme of God in the gospel reveals that God is righteous in the fullest manner and measure imaginable. And the gospel totally reveals that. And I take this to mean that if you come to any point of the Bible and you look on God and you say, you are not righteous, then it means that you have not yet looked closely at the gospel, or you've looked at it, but the gospel was not yet revealed to you. Because this is Paul's point. Now, I want you to turn in your Bibles to Romans chapter 3. I want to read verses 9 through 11 and kind of just walk you through some things through chapter 3. We will look at these in much greater detail when we get to chapter 3, but they serve to prove the point, I think, very well this morning. Romans 3, verse 9, are we Jews any better off than anybody else in the world? Because we're Jews, you know. We've got the blood of Abraham coursing through us. We've been circumcised in our bodies. We've kept the law. We have the priesthood. The promises made to us. Are we Jews any better off than anybody else in the world? Not at all. Because we've already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin. Just as it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. None is righteous. Now, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. But then you may know that the righteousness of God is something that must be imparted to us apart from us, because he's already charged that everyone, both Jews and Greeks, are not righteous. So look at verse 19, chapter 3. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law. And he's making a point back up to what he just said in starting in verse 11, when he quotes from the Old Testament, none is righteous, not even one. Now this is going back to the Psalms. Now this is a part of the comprehensive system of law that the Israelites had. He says, now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under law. So he's saying, what you read there in the Psalms about none being righteous, that was talking about you. That was talking about Jews. That's what he's saying. We know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped. In other words, there can't be a Jewish mouth saying it's only the Gentiles who are unrighteous, because he says there's a word from God to Jews that says nobody's righteous. Therefore, every mouth before God is going to be silent. So he says, so that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For by works of law, no human being will be justified in his sight. Now those words, no human will be justified in the sight of God, that word justified is the same word as being made righteous. In the Greek language, it's the same word, and you could use it nuanced in a couple different ways, but it means the same thing. To be righteous is to be justified, depending on how you look at it. It's the same word. So he's saying, by works of law, no human being will be righteous before God. All right? So now there becomes a problem. Because if I am saved, the implication is that I've been made righteous. But I'm not righteous. So how exactly did this happen? Look down to verse 21. Now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. Law and the prophets always talked about this. This is not like this is a game changer at the end of time, and God said, well, let's do it different. This is what God always planned throughout history. Law and prophets bear witness to this. The righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. This points back up to what he quoted from the Old Testament, so that every mouth may be stopped. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. Now, catch this. This was to show God's righteousness. This was to show God as righteous. This God putting forward Jesus as a propitiation, which is a word we don't use in English, but it means like to appease a divine being who is directing wrath toward you. How do you make a divine being not angry any longer with you? You have to make propitiation in some way. The problem is there's nothing I can do that would make propitiation, because I can't do anything especially good. No sacrifice is going to be something God would look on and say, that's actually a good sacrifice. Not if it came from me. So God put forward Jesus as a propitiation. So God was angry with us. And God knew, you cannot make propitiation. You can't appease my wrath. So God then took a part of himself, Jesus, and put him forward and said, you will be the one to make propitiation for the people I'm angry with. So he says, all that was to show God's righteousness. Because in his divine forbearance, he had passed over former sins. It was to show his righteousness at the present time so that he might be both just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. Now, Paul implies, there's the implicit understanding in those last words of Paul that there was something in the conduct of God that man, when looking closely at it, could peg it against God as somehow being an unrighteousness on the part of God. Because he says that God did this, which was to show God righteous, because he had passed over former sins. And so the thing was, when God passed over which, by the way, if you go back in the Old Testament, there will be countless instances where either Israel corporately or an individual within Israel was not punished by God for doing some grave thing against him. The best example would be David. Now, David is classified as a man after God's own heart, right? But we know that David committed probably one of the worst sins you can imagine. There may be something worse, but I mean, he got this lady pregnant, and then after he found out she's pregnant, he went and murdered her husband. You know, you think about it, if that happened today, if somebody did that, you'd be like, whoa, that's about as bad as you can get. And the thing that astounds me is in the account when it happened, Nathan came bringing the wrath of God, and David just said, I've sinned. And then the word right back to David from Nathan through God, from God through Nathan, is you will not surely die. God just, let's just put that away. You just got this lady who wasn't your wife pregnant, and then you killed her husband. Let's just put that away. How's that righteous? How's that just? People looked on that and they said, God is not righteous. And he says, no, he is righteous, and it is revealed in the gospel, because God took his wrath and redirected it to Jesus in the form that if you were to believe in that figure, Jesus, then you could be sheltered under him and given the provision of his righteousness, though you yourself don't have it. God took his wrath, redirected it to Jesus, and put it out there in the world, and we have that today. Now, this is the thing that strikes me most of all in this engagement that I had on social media this week, is that as I look about in the world today, the critique of the righteousness of God is literally the opposite of the critique that the ancient world had of the righteousness of God. Here's why I say that. The critique that the ancient world had in the righteousness of God was, God's not righteous because he didn't punish this wicked person. In other words, God is not just, same word, because he didn't punish this person who deserved punishment. The critique of God today is, how could God go kill a bunch of wicked people who deserve punishment and still be righteous? Is that not ironic? I mean, do you see that? This is a point, and this was revealed to me in a way that I don't think I've ever really thought about it until this week. We have so changed the standards of justice and love and righteousness that we would think that you can have righteousness, you can have justice served without some form of punishment on the wrongdoer. That can't be righteousness. It can't be justice. So for the Jews, the question, how could God be righteous and have destroyed those wicked people in Canaan's land who were sacrificing their sons and daughters on altars and were faithless, ruthless, heartless, would have created great trouble for the people of God. How could he be righteous and destroy those people? The Jews would say, what? That's like what justice is. That's what righteousness is. The harder question is, and I mean to me and for anybody, the harder question is, how does God make me and David, wicked men who were not righteous, who rebelled against God and therefore were wicked in his eyes, and make us somehow, apart from any works that I could conjure up in this being, to be holy and righteous beside the throne of God, where he'll say to me and you and anybody else who's faithful to Jesus on that day, well done, good and faithful servant. Jesus himself said, why do you call me good? There's none who is good but God. The biggest critique of the righteousness of God is not how does God destroy a wicked people. That's easy. The biggest critique is how does God save a wicked people and still be just? Because that means that he has to pass over sins to do it. And Paul says, well, he was proved to be righteous and just because he put forward Jesus, and he took all of the retribution, all of the wrath, all of the anger, all of that forbearance pent up inside of his being over the countless millennia of sins of man, and rained it down on Jesus. And now, if you enter into Jesus and become his brother and become a son of God because you believe in that sacrifice, then you can lift up Jesus before God and say, please take this as my sacrifice. That's amazing. I hope that God is somehow using my feeble body to present this truth that is so astounding that if the world could get it, it would change everything. I hope that is coming across in some way. There's a very kind young lady on social media who witnessed that whole engagement. She reached out to me in a private message, and I do not know her. She is a stranger. In a very kind and respectful way, she asked some questions about all this. She said, I want to talk to you because from what you've said in this social media setting, I think we must disagree on absolutely everything. And I said, and then she said, I don't mean that in a bad way. We're coming from total ends of the spectrum, and I think it would be cool to pick the brain of somebody who sees the world so differently. And in this engagement that we had back and forth, I said, or she said to me after I made some statements about the righteousness of God and how retribution and justice actually works. I said, look, there is no justice served without punishment in any society ever. You can't call it justice. There's never been a society where there is not both a gracious and a wrathful side of justice. And she said, couldn't there be a justice served without wrath? And I said, if there could be, it's a good question, then God would have opted to do that rather than to witness and observe his son, with whom he had a perfect communion for ages, who never did a thing wrong, and witness him down there under the scorn of the world being beaten to a bloody pulp and suffering the most agonizing death anyone can imagine, and that be his boy, and he witnessed the whole thing and choose to do that because God knew that's the only way. If there were any other way, God would not have done the cross. God did the cross because it was the only way, and what we should understand is it shows the grand measures our God will go to reach out to us in our depravity and wickedness and bring us unto him. That's the good news of the gospel of Jesus. That's why I'm not ashamed of it. I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it's the only power in the world to save man, and I'm not ashamed of the gospel because when you look at it, it shows that God was righteous in both the conquest of Canaan and the destruction of all the people there, but the salvation of one prostitute woman in the midst of it, saving her and her family. God was both just in wiping out all the rest of them and in saving Rahab. Have you ever thought about that and considered that? God was just in both acts because we understand in the New Testament that the salvation of God comes through a grounded and deep faith in the sacrifice that God would one day provide, irrespective of whether or not you were before that sacrifice, like David was, like Abraham was, like Rahab was. If God ever saved a man, it wasn't because he was good. It was because he had faith in the God who would one day provide a sacrifice. And if God ever destroyed a man, it was because God could see in the deepest place there is no faith, no belief, and therefore no participation in my sacrifice. And therefore, wrath is all that there is. Gospel is a power of God for salvation. We need to know how to craft that and articulate that and bring that to the world, because they need it right now. If you have any need at all, if you want to come into Christ, later in Romans chapter 6, Paul is going to talk about, do you not know that as many of you as were baptized into Christ, were baptized into his death, in order that just as he was raised from the dead, you too were raised up to walk in newness of life. The new life begins at the point of baptism, and it does not end there. It continues on forever. But if you need to be baptized and put on Jesus because you believe in him this morning, please let that be known while we sing this song.